Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now. We live forever. Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now. We live forever.
Yeah, our lovers and our doctors have no business having more information and awareness of our bodies than us. And so in order to have true sovereignty, we have to have self-awareness around the geography of what we're governing.
Welcome back to the Unbroken Chain podcast. I'm so happy to be here with you. I recently got back from a couple weeks of ceremony with one of my teachers, Oso, and I was so grateful to spend some time learning from him and working with a couple ceremonies, including Vision Quest, which I've been looking forward to for about a year now. I actually don't have a lot of great words about it yet. It was such a non-verbal experience, but I did just want to say that I think the idea of prayer is something that I've been on a long journey with. It used to be something that I all out rejected as the trappings of colonizer religion and patriarchy and control. And as I've reconnected to my intuition over the past several years and worked with different rituals and medicines, I've come to see that prayer is really just a manifestation of intention and a way of being clear with the universe what my co-collaborative intentions are. And Vision Quest is really, as I understand it, is really about prayer. It's not about like going into the woods and asking for wish fulfillment, but the way that Oso taught it to me is that it's almost a sacrifice. It's a way of acknowledging the nourishment and sustenance that we get from the earth on a daily basis and in many ways take totally for granted. And it's a way to go and pray for the healing of the land and the peoples that lived there. So I just wanted to give a brief description of what happened. But we went out to this land where a massacre occurred in the 1600s, and many indigenous people were killed by settlers, women, children, men. And before you go into Quest, you have to make a certain number of prayer ties, which are little squares of fabric that you fill with tobacco, touch to your forehead, make a prayer, and then tie onto a string. This year, the number that we had to complete was 70 prayer ties of 7 different colors, so almost 500 altogether. So he takes you out into the woods, and he chooses a spot where you're secluded. You can't see or hear anybody else. And he wraps the prayer ties around some saplings to create a little protected space, and then leaves you with a blanket, a little popushkomi, a little pot of fire, basically, so you can keep a fire going if you want. And then he comes back for you 4 days and 4 nights later. You don't eat or drink the whole time. And I've fucked with fasting a little bit, but nothing like that. That was certainly the longest that I've ever gone without eating, and definitely the longest I've ever gone without drinking. And I basically didn't move the whole time. I was kind of drifting in and out of consciousness. The mosquitoes were so insane, and they did not care at all about my hippy-dippy little essential oil-based bug spray. So for a lot of it, I was just trying to figure out how to lay still enough that my little blanket could cover every inch of my skin, and then I had this handkerchief over my face. So I wasn't really sleeping well at night. The mosquitoes were so loud in my ear. I kept thinking about that children's book, Why Do Mosquitoes Buzz in People's Ears? And I couldn't actually remember the moral of the story. But it was kind of a blessing in a way, because I spent most of it in this half in and out state of consciousness, and information would definitely come to me in that process, and I'd sort of pop into my normal consciousness, and this crystalline sentence almost would be in my mind, and then I'd kind of digest that and say, okay, tell me more, and then I'd lay back and breathe and kind of melt back into this lucid dream state. You can't read or write anything during the time either. Osa's just like, you sit there and you pray. And then by the third day, I was just so alert, so conscious. It was almost painful. I've had this experience in plant medicine before, but it was almost painful to have a conscious thought. The act of thinking and having a human consciousness about the world was so uncomfortable that it felt much better just to like breathe and look at the trees. And I had some animal spirits that came to visit me, but for the most part, it was really unsexy, really unromantic. It was not about like the spirits walking through the trees and coming to greet me and give me gifts. No, this was between me and my consciousness. And one of the most challenging things I've ever done, and absolutely one of the great teachers in that way as well. So I actually ended up coming back from the quest a night early. So I did 4 days and 3 nights. I just was so fixated on drinking water and felt pretty weak. So I came back to camp, and Oso put me into sweat lodge, which is pretty trippy because when you're that dehydrated, you don't actually sweat, but he makes the sweat super moist. He puts a lot of water on the rocks, and yeah, that's the container for the experience. And I feel beyond privileged that I was able to do that during a pandemic. But it really reinvested me with the clarity that prayer is a daily imperative for me, especially during this time, to use my energy and intention like a laser is my toolkit right now at this point in the world. I don't have a ton of resources, financial resources, material resources, but I do have will and energy and clarity. And I really needed to be in a place of non-consumption of food, of content, in order to be able to come back into my body as an instrument of that will. And that really takes me into our guest this week, a really beautiful human and teacher named Samantha Zipporah. She's an educator and support person for rites of passage of all kinds, but particularly related to reproductive and sexual health. She says she finds joy and purpose, which I think you'll hear, inspiring people to claim their power through body literacy and sovereignty. And that's especially looked like reinvesting in the magic that's available in our fertility and our sexuality. People with wombs and ovaries who bleed, really reconnecting to those cycles, which are inextricable from the cycles of nature and can actually teach us so much about how to thrive in this world. So it is such a gift that people like Samantha are making the resources available for us to reconnect to those innate tools that we carry in our bodies just because we are human. I cannot encourage you enough to go check out her resources on her website and on her Patreon. I don't know how to access many of the kinds of offerings that she provides any other place in such a coherent way. It includes books on holistic healing after abortion and miscarriage, trainings for providing support for abortion and miscarriage, conscious contraception, which looks like pharmaceutical-free contraception, and ovulation awareness. And she asks questions like, how can we support people through these processes spiritually, ritually, and ceremonially? How do we become excellent, compassionate, non-judgmental, non-medical, heart-centered keepers of these ways? This conversation is a really sweet beginning to kind of opening up where we are culturally and how we think about our bodies, particularly in relation to fertility right now. But I mean, she's an incredible resource for if you're actually curious about like what non-medical abortion looks like, what non-medical contraception looks like. She is the woman for that and so much more. So before we jump into the conversation, I just want to read a couple excerpts from a book that she references. It's called The Great Cosmic Mother, Rediscovering the Religion of the Earth by Monica Sue. Yeah, I just wanted to read these 2 sections to kind of set us up in the psycho-spiritual space that we're going to be playing in with Samantha. She writes, "Our consciousness is a property of our biological being. At the deepest levels of biological and of physical being, all consciousness in the universe is inextricably linked in a galactic network or webwork of mutual awareness and mutually interchanging gestalt. This mutual interaction may be described as the brain of God, in which all quote-unquote thoughts are living realities. This is where we live, either mutually evolving or mutually dying, just as all thoughts either realize themselves or die. Within such a living and dying cosmos, how can we make rational distinctions between spirit and flesh, between spiritual systems and political systems and economic systems and social systems? Clearly, they are all bound together as interacting thoughts. Later, she writes, God is the universe. We are all now living inside the body of God. There is nowhere to go to get there. We are already here. There's nowhere to go to get outside of God. There is just a forgetting of this truth. It is impossible not to be living right now and always within God's body. It is only possible to be aware or unaware of this fact. So now I'm going to let Samantha pick us up and take us into really the physiological embodiment of this godness, of your godness, of my godness, and what it means to really step into and own that. So, with gratitude, here is the beautiful Samantha Zipporah. So I want to ask you about fear, because I really love how you talk about this realization that you had at some point in your journey. You'd been doing birth work mainly, and then had this revelation that who you are and the work that you do encompasses so much more than that, and that you're really a witch. And I feel like, I mean, you've made this point before, that many of the things that you're speaking about throughout history have, you know, women have been killed for speaking about the things that you're speaking about. And even today, I think taboo is still such a strong cultural silencer. So yeah,
Totally.
I'd love to hear where all that sits with you and how you've come to this place of transparency.
Oh, thank you for asking. I feel like maybe you saw my recent social media post that spoke to that a little bit. Yeah, I think it comes back to body awareness and rooting oneself in their embodied felt experience has been probably the most helpful process for me in finding stability and integrity in speaking the truth. So when I tune into what is actually happening inside of me and my body, and I can still feel the fear and the anxiety and the stigmas and the danger that is so present and strong in our collective around the issues that I speak of. And occasionally those things will find their way into me in a bigger way. But when I sit and do body awareness meditation, which is something I do for decision making in general and as a daily practice, I feel that fear is very much an external thing. When I feel it, it's usually like in the front of my cranium. And it's like this really frenetic kind of heavy feeling that is in my head. And, you know, I trust my heart and I trust my belly more than I trust my brain. In general, I feel like, and I do, the womb and the heart in particular are really wise beyond our neocortexes and what creates life force and what carries on the intelligence of our life force. And consistently when I check in about how to speak and how to act, I try and resource myself from feeling into my body rather than listening to the external narratives. So, yeah.
I get the sense too, like yesterday, I guess you were sharing on social media that you had some speculums to give away. Yeah, and it really, I gotta say, it blew my mind a little bit because it is still like, even for me, like I've never looked inside my own body, and that just, here I am 31 years old, like it really, there's so much more ahead of me on the path of like self-knowledge. And I'm so curious about how the physical and the spiritual and like the deep inner knowing that we have, how that comes through our bodies as well as, our spiritual selves.
Right. And how many pelvic exams have you had from care providers? Several, at least?
Yeah, I would say like 5 probably.
Yeah. So that's cervical self-exam is such a journey. There was a point in my life where I was teaching it a lot more frequently. I've probably taught at least a few hundred people how to find their cervixes in person. And the way that I have to do that is by showing them. Mm-hmm. So it was really funny because I had taught like 2 or 3 cervical self-exam classes before I went on this massive cross-country teaching tour a few years ago. And I was leaving the town, the first workshop that I did. And, even though I had carefully planned all this curriculum and I had done all this marketing of, hey, here's the content, we're going to be doing cervical self-exams, we're going to be doing this and that in this 2-day workshop, like it didn't bodily hit me until I just remember sitting in my van and driving and being like, oh my God, I'm showing my cervix to hundreds of people this summer. Like,
wow.
What am I doing? But it's in service to this self-awareness and this reality that, our lovers and our doctors have no business having more information and awareness of our bodies than us. And so in order to have true sovereignty, we have to have self-awareness around the geography of what we're governing, right? Like sovereign is this very political term about self-governance. And if you don't understand the territory that you're governing, then you can't do a good job ruling it.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah. So I'd love to send you a speculum.
Awesome. I will take you up on that. Yeah. Well, I definitely want to open up sort of the world of women's magic and the power that comes through that particular lineage and identification. But I did first want to ask, because one of my oldest and dearest friends in the world is a trans woman who does not bleed. I just wanted to kind of start by asking you about how you hold that container around womanhood.
Oh my goodness. I do my very best when I teach and speak and work with clients to address anatomy and not identity, and to create spaciousness for whatever the individual might identify with who has this anatomy. But I'm so passionate that learning the practical physical realities of our anatomy is such an empowering thing that I want to make my offerings as accessible to as many different identities as possible to be able to learn about the functionality of their anatomy. And then if we want to alter our anatomy or our biochemistry, as some trans and non-binary folks like to do, and tons of cis women also alter their biochemistry and their anatomy through hormonal birth control, hormone replacement therapy and menopause, all these things. But just that we need to have this foundation of awareness of what is the baseline that we're working with. So I've been through a lot of portals with inclusivity for trans and non-binary folks. I have been called out and burned at the stake really violently in different progressive communities that I was part of when I lived in Portland, Oregon. And I've also, been a doula for trans men having abortions, and I've been a support person for trans men going through HPV experiences. And I also have trans and non-binary friends who have stuck with me throughout the different renditions of attacks that I've experienced. So it's just, I know that there's a diversity of experiences, and I do my most humble best to try and create as much spaciousness and inclusivity as I can in the work, while being really clear that gender oppression based on our anatomy and identity is also a very serious issue that we need to be aware of. So, I mean, that's a really expansive and multi-layered topic, but bottom line for me is doing my best to be as inclusive as possible.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. And I'm so sorry that you've had such a traumatic experience dealing with that.
Oh, thank you. I mean, we all learn through it. And the first trans woman who came to one of my workshops, they came to an ovulation awareness workshop. And we're so present, and they were just like, well, so how do I get into this? And I didn't even think twice. I just remember just being like, well, you have the moon.
Yeah.
So, I mean, connecting to this cyclical nature of creation is not something that is limited to having a womb. However, having a womb gives us a really epic, tangible, visceral access to it that is not as easily accessed when we're not cycling and having a womb ourselves. So, but it doesn't make it impossible.
Well, so that makes me want to talk a little bit about what I shared with you in my email about my personal journey with my cycle. So just a very brief, just snapshot of that. I started my period pretty late. I think I was about 14 years old. And then when I was 16, I started hormonal birth control for acne. And in my early 20s, I switched, because I had migraines, I was put on progesterone birth control, where I just stopped having a period altogether. So in my life up to about a year and a half ago, I had only had maybe 2 years in my early teenhood when I was just bleeding naturally. And for a long time, that was awesome and easy, and I didn't think about my period at all. And then at some point, as I started working with plants and psychedelic medicines, I just started getting this kind of persistent message that was like, you're missing out on something really important. And it took me a while to be able to even hear that, because I grew up with stories about women of my mom's generation who were limited by the fact that they didn't have access to good birth control, and, horror stories about back alley abortions and all of that. So it's very surreal to me in a way to now be somebody that is not on birth control, is sexually active, but I would love... I feel still like I'm very early in my journey of learning what that relationship with my body is all about. And I would love to hear from you sort of what that voice was and what the invitation is.
What the voice was that was sort of to my cycle?
Yeah, that's sort of saying hey, you're invited into something important here. There's information here that if you fully allow your cycle to move through, you can really be a teacher and powerful.
Yeah, for me, it did start with an intellectual belief, and I don't know where this came from, because my journey started very young. I started studying before I started bleeding. Christian Northrup's book, Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, and Rosemary Gladstar's Herbal Healing for Women, which to this day are two of my absolute favorite resources. Highly recommend to anyone and everyone. I started reading and studying before I started bleeding because of my mother's hysterectomy and my sister's extremely painful periods that caused crazy mood swings, and she was prescribed Vicodin for.
Wow.
And so for some reason, I always felt different than them. And I felt like I could learn how to have a healthy body, and that having a uterus should not equate with suffering. And I do not know where I got that idea to this day. Like, I have no idea. There was nothing in my immediate home or my normal public school life here in Boise, Idaho, that gave me this idea that I could learn how to have a healthy cycle. So it really started with a quest for knowledge and understanding and just this natural fascination. I was just like, wow, this is so cool. And I have this idea that it's a source of power, not of subjugation. And that, like, this isn't how, it's not supposed to be painful. So yeah, my start was before I even started bleeding. And I started my first period actually at the movie theater watching The Matrix.
Oh my gosh. Amazing.
So there was, there was like this weird paradigm, sort of the world that everybody else agrees on being real is not the real world. I definitely had that feeling with my womb cycle and my body and my consciousness from a really young age. Like, I was looking around at what I was seeing in my family and in the dominant culture and being like, this is not the truth. And then, since then I've been through a lot of really profound experiences, both personally and then eventually professionally, that have taught me about how to follow that voice and that narrative. And it's been a very top-down journey for me. It started very fiercely intellectual and rigidly, like, rebellious and still very attached to the kind of patriarchal value of being driven by data and science and fact. And I have, in the last few years, really been undergoing a deep blossoming and transformation where I'm able to access and celebrate the power of art and story and feelings as perhaps more important than facts. But I'm always a bridge. I do think that is like one of the really very unique things that I offer, is that I think that what I offer is very balanced in both the spiritual and the scientific perspective and information. And what I like to do is create as much clarity about physiology as possible as a foundation for people to then have spaciousness for inquiry and exploration of the psychospiritual and emotional truths that are real for them, but be like, hey, let's like rule out the mystery of the physiology, because we've been suffering from massive amounts of mis and disinformation in our culture that are wildly disempowering and oppressive.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was really a response to your question specifically, but I'll take a pause there.
Well, no, I think that's really important, and maybe something important to unpack a little bit too is like why, sort of a snapshot of why we are where we are culturally right now, and why women's bodies and cycles have become so mysterious even to us. Can you help unpack a little bit, like who is that serving?
Right. Yeah, the wealthy white dudes with money and power want more money and power. And I mean, there's a paper trail. There's a longer history, of course, of patriarchy in general. If people want to check out the resources actually that I sent your way, The Mysteries of the Dark Moon, The Healing Power of the Dark Goddess, and The Great Cosmic Mother are two really great sources for putting our situation in a more historical context of Western civilization. The Chalice and the Blade is another amazing book about this. So the dawn of the Bronze Age, I believe, which I feel like it's like several hundred years BC, and I don't have a really great brain for numbers all the time. But we're only a few thousand years into this patriarchal construct that is all about dominance and dualism, right?
Yeah.
So it's like this dualism that exalts the spirit or the spiritual as something that is external and separate from the flesh, right? And then the idea that the spirit, the spiritual self, this intellectual self, which has been equated also with this divine power, is like our cognition, that we need to dominate the flesh and control the flesh because it's wild and dangerous and evil. And so the opposite of that is this awareness in non-dualism, in animism, in goddess and earth worshipping cultures, which have existed in the vast, vast majority. Like, people really need to understand this context. So like the vast majority of human history, the rituals and the practices and the beliefs of humans have honored the earth and women's bodies as source. Because they are. And so, how did we get here? We got here through this compartmentalization of mind, body, and spirit, and demonization of the body, demonization of the feminine, and this grab for power and control that both the church and state, which have not been separate for very long, really have done a number on us. It's really like mind blowing, like I'm deep in the work, doing the work all day, most days. And then like occasionally I pop my head out and look around and like just freak out about how perverse and pervasive. And oh my goodness, I've never put those two words together. And now I need to look up their etymology. But like how perverse and pervasive it is that most people who ovulate and menstruate and can give birth think that all of those experiences are painful and that they're literally afraid of how those things work.
Yes. And
willfully hand over their power to the church or state or the institutions of the medical system, which is essentially like a religion today. When it's our greatest source of power, right? This is like, we are God. Like, this is our direct dial to the divine and our power as creators. And like voluntarily medicating away your ovulation and numbing your birth and removing your babies surgically. Like, it's really, really wild how afraid people are of their own power and how willing they are to trust an external authority because they don't trust themselves.
Yeah. I've noticed in myself too that I really bought the story of convenience and that my period was really inconvenient.
How inconvenient to be like omnipotently powerful. It is. It's inconvenient. It's a really massive responsibility.
Yeah. So in your paradigm, or the paradigm that I think you offer people who don't want to completely put their power into the hands of the medical industrial complex, like how do we approach that power with responsibility, and what could sort of a conscious approach. I love your term, conscious contraception. What does that entail to really take that on and take it back, take the power back?
Yeah. First of all, I just want to actually also speak to this reality that the company Bayer just bought out Monsanto last year.
Oh, I did not know that.
And that is the company that created the gas for the extermination chambers in the Holocaust. It's a German company that was tried in the Nuremberg trials. And that Bayer owns well over half of the conventional hormonal contraceptive methods that are created and consumed in our culture. And that we have over half of our potentially ovulating population are voluntarily medicating away their ovulation, which is what I wish that hormonal birth control pills were just called ovulation prevention pills. So you're asking about how do we claim our power, and without being too salesy, I want to share that I do have an entire course about this.
Yes.
My conscious contraception course. And what is offered in that course is beginning with cycle awareness, which offers both the anatomy and physiology of understanding your ovulation and your menstruation on a very nuanced level of like, what is this actual tissue? How do these muscles work? Like, what are the hormones that are changing and why are they important? And how do I eat to support these hormonal shifts? And then upon that awareness of the normal integrity of the cycle, of like, what is the cycle doing when we're not fucking with it? That then we use our willpower, our embodiment, and our consciousness to avoid a pregnancy by embodying those values, which will mean not putting sperm in your vagina when you're fertile, which is on average 3 to 6 days out of a month, in contrast to the every single day of the folks that have sperm. And then I walk folks through also materia medica of a handful of my favorite plant allies that are really helpful for stimulating menstruation and potentially inhibiting implantation if we do accidentally get sperm in our vaginas, which is something that happens sometimes, like we're human. And I call this, like, working with the sacred yes is also really important in a conscious contraception process. Instead of focusing on the no of like, no, I don't want a baby, no baby, no baby, they're so scary, that we actually actively claim and embody and articulate what it is that we do want to be conceiving and gestating and birthing. And like, what is the purpose of our sexual encounters, especially? And I think that this is a profound shift, and that's a meditative process that I encourage all of my students and clients, and I practice myself, is that like, when I'm starting to be turned on and in a sexual stimulating situation, I think that it is really healthy to spend anywhere from like 15 seconds to 5 minutes or longer, like really, really acknowledging what I am doing with this sexual energy. Like, what is my desire here? Because I know that I'm a portal and that sexual energy is a transcendent, powerful, vital essence that I'm invoking, and that making a human child is merely one of the things that I can invoke. And so I think by specifically naming the sacred yes, naming what it is that you do want instead of just avoiding what you don't want, is some really profound medicine for conscious contraception. So yeah, self-awareness, just like starting to check in every day, is getting off of synthetic hormones, removing the inanimate objects from inside of your uterus, and reviving your body ecology. Our bodies are ecosystems. Our bodies are the earth. And by inserting an inanimate object into one of the most integral power sources, which is our womb, or by silencing the communication between our ovaries and our brains, which is what synthetic hormonal birth control does, we are really interrupting the functionality of the ecosystem. And that it's not just preventing pregnancy, it is preventing the function and the flow of a lot of other different aspects of integrity and communication that are necessary for health.
So you're talking about the ecosystem of the entire body.
I am, because the conversation that the ovaries have with the hypothalamus pituitary axis every month, if we're healthily ovulating, that conversation affects our cognition, affects our mineral absorption, affects the calcium deposits in our bones, affects so many different aspects of our health and well-being. And when you silence that communication and take it offline, there are a whole lot of different things as like downstream, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are involved in this circuitry that you're impeding the function of.
So something that I've noticed in myself lately is that I have an app on my phone where I track my cycle, and it's actually helped me understand and have a lot more compassion for myself, because I have a really hard time premenstrually for like a week or a week and a half. And that story used to be just like, I'm crazy and I have hard times sometimes and I get depressed. And now I think it's much more like I can anticipate those times coming. And it of course doesn't make them any easier when I'm in them, but at least I understand that it's part of a cycle.
Yes.
Yeah. What is that all about?
What is the premenstrual window all about?
Yeah.
Well, first I want to just encourage you to check in with your app and make sure they're not farming your data out to Big Brother.
Okay.
Because there are some that are great and there are some that are doing that.
Do you want to shout out any good ones?
I used Kandara for a really long time. I know there were some pretty radical burners that started that. And I actually don't know because I don't use the apps. Mm-hmm. It's been a while since I did research. It was like the last time that I published my ovulation awareness zine, like 4 years ago. So I'm not the best source of that, but you can check out the interwebs. So, premenstrual week. Oh my God. So intense. I feel you. And there is so much to that on so many different dimensions. So I'm like, what's the entry point? But I think that the main thing that you were saying before going too deep into the nuance of like, well, what are the hormonal components of this? And what are the psycho-spiritual purposes of this? Because there are, right? It's just that being aware of the context of your experiences internally within this ecosystem. It's so much just like the weather. It's just like being ready to dress for the weather. You're like, oh, there's probably going to be a crazy storm now, and I should not go out in a sundress. Like, I need like some layers of wool and a rain resistant jacket and maybe some galoshes. And if you get dressed correctly, like there's no bad weather, there's just bad gear. So
I love it. Yeah.
Right. And then like you also know when it's going to be nice. So knowing that, your hormones and the way that they also affect your psycho-spiritual reality, when you can be aware of how they move cyclically, you can dress correctly, like on an emotional level, or your relationships can become adapted to this as well, where your intimate partners or the people that you work with, your family, can be aware that like, this is the weather. Like you don't argue with the weather. You don't try and change the weather. It is more powerful than you and your ego's desires. I think the metaphor that I use for this a lot is like the apple tree through the seasons. There's a lot of teachings out there around the 4 weeks of the menstrual cycle being the 4 seasons of the earth. And I definitely use that framework in my courses. And so the premenstrual week is the late fall. It's fucking Halloween. It's Samhain. Right? It's like the ghouls and the goblins and the witches, and the veil is thin, and you're getting ready to go into the darkness. And one of the things that I find really interesting about that seasonal metaphor with the cycle and the premenstrual week is kind of like when you're getting ready for winter, if you didn't grow enough food and preserve it correctly, like if you don't have enough sustenance to get through the winter, then you might freak out.
Yeah.
If there's a hole in your roof, like this is the time to fix it. So I feel like some of the hypervigilance that we get and the extreme critical attitudes that we have are part of just like assessing our weaknesses so that we can have a comfortable, safe winter, which is when we're actively bleeding. Right. So it's like preparing the nest and making sure that we have enough to eat and that we have enough firewood. And like, if there's scarcity, then there's going to be a lot of anxiety. And the metaphor being like, you know, if your relationship with your partner doesn't have enough like emotional or spiritual nourishment for you, like you're going to lash out. So the tree metaphor, just to circle back, I think I started and didn't finish it. The one that I use all the time is like, if you go and yell at an apple tree in the middle of winter, like, where are my apples? Like, who's an idiot?
Right. It's on you.
It's not the tree.
Yeah.
And that is the equivalent of the patriarchy trying to extract productivity and stasis and functionality from a woman when she's actively bleeding. Like, it's just bullshit. Like, so that's another thing around premenstrual syndrome in our culture. That's word syndrome, and I don't need to use that, but like the feelings of grief or rage or anxiety or intensity that come up in the premenstrual week, I think also without even having any physical or biochemical reasons, which there are plenty given our diet and environmental toxins, but just on a cultural and psycho-spiritual level, the reality that when we're bleeding, it is really healthy for us to be in some level of prayer and meditation and seclusion and quietness. And if you don't have that, then it makes sense that you're going to be freaking out before you bleed. Of just like, sit the fuck down is essentially what I feel like our psyches are screaming at us. Is just like, stop it. Stop it. Stop doing. Stop doing.
God, that's been such a mantra for me lately and feels so tied to what we're going through as a collective right now. Yes. Is like, you have to feel your feelings. And I'm sorry that it's really unpleasant sometimes, but it's worse when you don't feel them.
Yes.
It's interesting too, because women's bodies are just, I mean, it's so potent symbolically because yes, we have the capacity for fertility and creation, but we also contain death and endings. And again, just culturally, we don't know how to honor that at all. So much fear around that. And yet we're riding that ending, that death, on a monthly basis.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's so helpful. I just had this random memory of one of my girlfriends, just having coffee with her when I was in the thick of my abortion and miscarriage support work. So I was a birth doula for a decade. I'd always been doing abortion and miscarriage support kind of on the side for friends and community members and random people on social media through direct message. And I finally professionalized those services and created a training for other people to do that work too. And it eclipsed my birth work. I had to quit attending births because I could not be on call for a birth and needing to go attend an abortion at the same time.
Oof.
It was not good.
Yeah.
I did it for a while. It was talk about, gatekeeping and just like holding space for this transformation of spirit and matter that happens in our uteruses. So yeah, she was like, that sounds so depressing, like so sad, like so intense. And like, you must feel a lot of that heaviness and grief, and like, how do you cope with it? And I was sitting there and really authentically not feeling that sadness or grief or intensity, even though I had been attending a lot of abortions and miscarriages. And it just came to me very simply. I was just like, well, I have a really serious Moon Lodge practice. Like I let go. I have a really, really committed and sacred practice of releasing when I bleed. And I don't have to hold on to any of it. Like, yes, I process it and I am aware of it and it does move through me, but I don't hold on to it. And that's such a huge gift that we have in our anatomy if we're able to actually let go and make space for it, and name the things that we're letting go of.
So you're speaking about an emotional, ideological release along with the physical.
Yes. And then here I'll just give a shout out for Wild Power from the Red School, and just the existence of the Red School at all, which is wonderful. In my many years of reading and studying and practicing, I didn't come upon Wild Power, it's a book, until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was written. So I had been like piecing together all these different things and finding what fit for me. And then Wild Power, I would say, is the most clear, articulate statement about my personal beliefs and practices that I found out there. And it talks about the menstrual cycle as a tool of your soul's evolution.
Oof.
Right. And that the first half of the cycle leading up to ovulation is all about defining and embodying and manifesting your ego and your will out in the world externally. And then the second half of the cycle, it's all about deconstructing and evaluating and refining and ego death. And that by the time you get to the point where you're bleeding again, the point, like the precipice where you begin bleeding, is this merging with universal consciousness and this surrender of all of that, the last bits of your ego that need to be cleansed and washed free so you can start a new cycle. And what is left in that next cycle has so much more integrity and purity and truth, because you've gone through this refinement process of the premenstrual phase.
Makes me so emotional. Like, what an honor to have a built-in system to do that.
Yay.
And
Super
to echo, what's happening with the seasons and the tree outside my window, and to just recognize in myself that I'm a reflection of the greater project here.
Yes.
It's such an honor.
Way to connect. It's really lovely. I really like it. But yeah, it's really interesting to me also. Like, I've been involved in a lot of permaculture and farm scenes in my day. Like, actually learned fertility awareness while I was doing a sustainable living internship on a farm off the grid. I just found a book on the shelf in the main house and was like, what? I can tell when I ovulate? Like, This is so cool. And just like how many people who are so in love with nature, women in particular, female, like folks with uteruses, there's so much wonder and infatuation and like fierce desire to protect the cycles of nature that are not in our bodies. And then this oblivion of disregard and ignorance around the cycles inside of our bodies as if they were not the same. And that it was like reasonable to medicate away your ovulation so that you could be a farmer or an environmental activist and like remain productive and functional in these external ways, instead of recognizing that our own menstrual and ovulation cycles are just as important as the cycles that are outside of our bodies to be able to protect and nourish.
And I want to be so clear too, and you make this very, I think, explicit in in the offerings that you provide about really how to walk through these things on a very practical level. But like what I'm saying is not like women should not protect their right to not have children. Like these things can both go hand in hand. Like I'm not just saying like bleed and get pregnant and, you know, just live with your lot, but that there's a huge there's a huge precedent for how to do this outside of like a medical context.
Yeah, the symptothermal method of fertility awareness is as effective as condoms when done correctly. It's 99.6% effective.
Woo.
Yeah. There are specific biomarkers that you can track to know when you're fertile. And then also we need to end rape culture so that no sperm ends up where it shouldn't be, unless it's like a mutual accident. That's a part of this whole narrative, is this idea that like we are vulnerable to pregnancy, and we are not vulnerable to pregnancy except when we are fertile, which is not even a quarter of our cycle. We definitely not trying to tell people they should just get pregnant because that's what nature says. And I definitely, spend a lot of time helping people not get pregnant. In fact, that's been the focus. I shifted from being primarily professionally identifying as a birth doula to helping people bleed.
I love thinking about it that way. Yeah.
We do more bleeding than birthing in our lifetimes. And it's also very late in the game to start being aware of your body when you are pregnant or birthing, of body sovereignty. And so the same principles of traditional midwifery care and traditional healing that are brought to like a home birth traditional midwifery perspective are needed for all of the cycles.
Part of why I'm so grateful for you and others that do the kind of work you do is because I have this profound sense of grief about how much has been lost in our current culture. But yeah, that includes like a community around all of this. It's so clear in the way you present this that like we're meant to accompany each other through these portals. I have the sense that like women have been doing this out in the open with no shame for so much longer than we've been doing it alone and in the dark.
Thank you for speaking to that. And it is like, I feel that in my heart when you like, there's just like this ache for me. And that, I didn't take money for 5 years of birth work.
Wow.
I did volunteer work. I worked with friends and acquaintances for trade. And I worked with teen moms and recently housed and recovering addicts moms. And when I started to take money for attending births, I felt really weird about it. And it took me a couple years of actively attending birth to really name that grief it was really transformative. It still is. I still walk with that grief and, process it with my bleeding and other rituals on a regular basis that like, I passionately believe that everything that I know and everything that I offer is a human right for people to have access to. And it's a really challenging and bizarre thing to try and fit it into capitalism and, pay my rent and make sure that I can buy food and have gas in my car and all these things. When I would just be giving it away for free all day, every day, if those, we had universal income. But none of this deserves to be hierarchical. This should not be hierarchical. This should not be commodified or specialized information. It should be universally, collectively, communally held within intimate, committed relationships that are not contractual and not in abusive power dynamics. Like this is for family. This is for dear ones. This is not something that you should have to hire a stranger to do to you or for you or tell you what to do.
Do you see some of those tides shifting, especially as information is becoming more available?
I sure hope so. I mean, I definitely feel like a huge tide shifting with social media just in the last few years. It's been really mostly beautiful and sometimes really bizarre to be like, what? There's so many other people out here doing this work. And like sometimes, I don't like particularly some of their methods or tones, but sometimes I do. And then I find allies and friends. And I think social media has been pretty profound in shifting this access to information. And that, more and more folks are waking up right now and to this recognition that the modern medical paradigm is an industry, not a healing modality. Maybe we shouldn't be trying to get healing out of an industry.
Yep.
So that's one of my philosophy points that I open all my classes and teach to is that the medical paradigm is an industry, not a healing modality, and it offers some useful goods and services. I don't demonize or deny the helpfulness of some of the goods and services that are available in that industry, but that the industry itself is systemically oppressive and built for hoarding the profit and power, not for actually empowering health or healing. So when we consume from an industry, it's our job to be conscious consumers and not think that the person that's trying to sell you something is wanting you to heal. Because actually, if you heal, they lose a customer.
Yeah, I think about that so much with antidepressants, but I hadn't really thought about it with birth control either. But like, what an ideal situation to have somebody taking a pill every day for the rest of their lives from the point of view of the pharmaceutical company. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like the most widely consumed medication that people who are not sick take.
Oof.
Right? But our culture, and I worked at Planned Parenthood for many, many years, and I think unwittingly added to this. And I made a shift and started studying midwifery, and it was like a big awakening for me. But like our dominant culture pathologizes fertility and pregnancy as if it were a disease that needed to be cured with pills and surgery. It's like, let me fix that problem for you.
Yeah, I hear so much joy in it for you, which is really a revelation.
Yeah, it's so fun. I personally, at this point, everything changes. The only constant is change, but I don't plan on making people with my body. I love babies and children and passionately want to be in committed co-creative relationships with families and mamas forever. But I don't see myself making people. And I was a a birth doula and a nanny for so many years, people were always asking me, like, when are you having babies? Don't you want babies? You'd be such a good mama. And I had like my political like propaganda, like soundbite response, because I just got so tired of people asking me. I'd say, children are an option, not a goal.
Ooh, yes.
For a really long time, like, I have other goals. And then I got a little more whimsical with it in the last handful of years. I've been like, I love ovulating. I'm just having so much fun ovulating.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so that was fun. And then I've kind of taken a darker turn in the last year or so and been like, well, economic slavery and climate crisis make it feel unsafe to make more people to me.
I'm right there with you. Yeah.
So, yeah. But yeah, joy. My Hebrew name means joy.
Really?
And I love, that the concept and the embodiment is something that I think a lot of, and that it's different than happiness, right? And so I do, have a lot of joy in my cycle and in my work, and that doesn't mean that there's not grief and sadness and bitterness and struggle and pain. I think of joy as like all of it, like all of the rainbow of emotions, but on the higher tonal spectrum of like, I feel everything is alive.
Yeah, I think for me that path goes hand in hand with awakening. It's just the willingness to really feel things and really experience things, and to embrace my body as like one of my main conduits for doing that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. There's just so much information available to us when we don't silence it or dissociate. That's a thing in my intimate personal process that I've been really navigating nuance around as somebody who really loves Tantric Buddhist and Zen Buddhist philosophies. I know they're not the same, but I was like, what is the difference between my compassionate, loving awareness and dissociation in the way that I relate to my feelings when they're not pleasant ones?
How do you discern the difference? That's really challenging.
I don't know. I'm in the middle of that question. Like, that is a question that I'm currently living through. So last month I had the anniversary of my uterine hemorrhage. That was one of my major initiations on my path as a healer. When I was 21, I had a uterine hemorrhage that was totally spontaneous, and there's really no physiologic reason. There's no science, but it makes so much sense on psychospiritual, like ancestral trauma, all kinds of other levels. But yeah, I lost 2/3 of my red blood cell count.
Whoa.
And got 6 blood transfusions and a dilation and curettage surgery. And I was already attending births and had already worked at Planned Parenthood. I was already on this path in a big way, but what that experience really brought the spiritual awareness to it, whereas I had been kind of stuck in the technocratic physical dimension before that. I'm just like hungry for the information. And then that was the thing that was like, oh wait, I'm a spiritual being having a physical experience. Like, this physical experience is not the whole story. So I went through some bouts of some PTSD this last month that really brought that question around like dissociation versus compassionate witnessing into question, which I think, just to circle back, I guess, to premenstrual demons.
Yep.
And just, right, that this is the menstrual cycle and the feelings that we feel throughout it being a tool, like a ballast and a tool for all of our cycles and all of our feelings, of just like, how do we relate to those painful experiences that we have in the premenstrual window? Like, how do you relate to those thoughts that you have? Like, do you identify with your thoughts and feelings, or are you able to be aware of like, all right, I'm having this feeling and it's not me, So how do we do that without dissociating from the feeling is the question here.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so grateful to hear you voice that, because I think that's been sort of like it's felt like a very private struggle of mine for a very long time, because I was like a super high wired kid, like just melted down all the time. Everything was too muchness. I was overwhelmed. And, as I grew up, I learned like, oh, alcohol is great to turn this off. And like, oh, food is great to turn this off. And so now as I'm in the process of like turning on those spigots again, it's like, okay, how do I do this in a way where I'm a vessel for the flames, but I'm not getting destroyed by them at the same time?
Totally. Which, again, that book, Wild Power, has some of the most practical tools that I've ever seen, specifically for the premenstrual phase and how to listen to the inner critic. And there's like a lot of psychology tools. There's like counsel work, inner counsel work. Are you familiar with that?
No.
As a concept where you give a voice or a caricature to the different mean voices. You make sure that you like don't identify with them. You just like sit down at a table and you listen to them, right? You're just like, what do you have to say? Like, what are you trying to tell me? And like maybe 90% of what they say is like complete bullshit, and needs to be ultimately disregarded. But giving them space to express themselves fully instead of telling them to shut up and go away, and then you find like that little nugget of gold down there in the nasty, nasty muck. Where you're just like, oh, that's a truth that I actually needed to look at, that I didn't want to look at.
I love that, because that telling them to shut up can take up so much space and energy, whereas actually just sitting down with them and like getting right into it is actually not that, once you listen, it's right there for you.
Yes.
Man, well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your openness with all of this. And again, like, you have so many resources available for people that I want to really point them towards. Where is the best place for people to find your work?
Yeah, it's myname.com. So Samantha Zipporah, ZIPPORAH.com. I'm pretty darn active on the Instagram. And I have a Patreon page. And yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really lovely. Until next time.
All right. You too.
Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now. We live forever. Sun is the reflection of a life within us. Life is God. We shine eternally. Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now. We live forever.
All right, my dear ones. You can also, of course, find me online, maurajames.com, and Maura James on Instagram. I also have a few offerings available at Sliding Scale. If you're looking for a little extra support during the unraveling, I'm available to hold space if that is of interest. I'm going to leave us with a poem. This is Audre Lorde in 1984 in Berlin, reading a poem of hers called A Woman Speaks. I love you, and I'll see you again soon.
Moon-marked and touched by sun, my magic is unwritten, but when the sea turns back, it will leave my shape behind. I seek no favor untouched by blood, unrelenting as the curse of love, permanent as my errors or my pride. I do not mix love with pity, nor hate with scorn, and if you would know me, look into the entrails of Uranus where the restless oceans pound. I do not dwell within my birth, nor my divinities, who am ageless and half-grown, and still seeking my sisters in Dahomey. Witches wear me inside their coiled cloths, as our mothers did, mourning. I have been woman for a long time. Beware my smile. I am treacherous with old magic and the noon's new fury. With all your wide futures promised, I am woman and not white.
Our souls are the centers of realization, in realization of life we love. In love we know that we live forever and shine eternally. Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane of now. We live forever. Eternal life is the intersection of the line of time and the plane